Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. So, if you're a first-year history student about to tackle your chapter on the 1950s, you might be expecting this simple black and white sitcom story, right? Poodle skirts, rock and roll, and just this magically booming post-war economy. But actually, scratch that. Today, we're going to build a clear mental framework to help you understand the major historical themes of this era. Our goal isn't just to memorize a list of events, it's to really understand why the 1950s looked the way they did and how that specific era built the exact foundation of the world we live in right now.
Okay, let's dive right in with a super famous quote from President Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address. He warned the nation about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. We're kicking things off with this warning to immediately signal that this era was vastly more complex than just happy days and natural economic booms. Eisenhower was a Republican and a former World War II general, and here he is pointing to a massive, permanent shift in how the American economy actually functioned.
So instead of memorizing a massive chronological list of dates, keep these four thematic buckets in mind while you read. The military-industrial complex, the new truce between labor and business, the heavy subsidization of the suburbs, and finally, how segregation engineered a lasting wealth gap.
Now, here is the central historical paradox of the 1950s that you absolutely must understand. The rhetoric of the time celebrated the triumph of the laissez-faire free market. Americans pointed to booming corporations as total proof that free market capitalism was vastly superior to Soviet communism. But the reality? This unprecedented prosperity was actually driven by massive federal government intervention and spending. It was essentially Keynesian economics, using government spending to stimulate the economy, just largely funneled through defense and infrastructure.
All right, let's jump straight into Theme 1, the military-industrial complex, and see how the Cold War justified this massive spending.
You're definitely going to want to highlight this term in your notes, military Keynesianism. It explains how fighting communism essentially subsidized private corporate growth. Think about it like this. Before the Great Depression, back in 1929, the federal government spent under $4 billion a year. By 1961, it was spending over $104 billion, with more than half of that devoted purely to national defense. And this wasn't just buying tanks. This was pumping massive amounts of taxpayer dollars into private industries, which stimulated immense economic demand. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates historical causation. The Cold War anti-communist crusade was the direct cause of massive federal investments in everyday civilian life. When the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, the U.S. freaked out and responded with the National Defense Education Act to fund science and math. They created NASA, which led to thousands of commercial spin-offs. DARPA funded the research that literally became the internet. Even the 1956 National Highway Act, which built our massive interstate system and heavily subsidized the auto, rubber, and suburban real estate industries, was actually passed under the guise of national defense. Its original purpose? To quickly evacuate cities during an atomic attack. Crazy, right?
Moving right along to Theme 2, let's explore how the government and corporations engineered a super stable, middle-class industrial workforce.
Picture this. Right after World War II, in 1946, America saw a massive wave of labor strikes. Millions of workers were completely terrified that the end of wartime production would mean going right back to the Great Depression. Following the union-weakening Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, labor and management really needed a new way to coexist. Enter the 1950 Treaty of Detroit. General Motors and the United Auto Workers struck this grand bargain. The union basically agreed to stop striking over corporate pricing and management decisions. In return, GM provided a huge 20% wage increase over 5 years, plus health insurance and pensions. It was a real game changer that established a private welfare model for labor-capital relations nationwide.
So the crucial point here is that this compromise worked incredibly well for the workers who were actually included in it. Just look at the data. Industrial worker weekly earnings took a massive leap from roughly $54 in 1949 to almost $72 by 1959. This unprecedented upward mobility elevated them into a broad mass middle class. For the first time, they could actually afford the consumer goods they were manufacturing.
Which brings us to Theme 3. We need to understand exactly where all these newly minted middle-class workers were spending their money, subsidizing the American dream.
We're looking at the massive expansion of the suburbs. But remember, this wasn't just some natural market force. It was deeply, deeply subsidized by the federal government. It really starts with the 1944 GI Bill. Designed to ease the transition of millions of returning veterans into the civilian workforce, it completely revolutionized higher education and the housing industry.
It provided unemployment assistance, paid for college tuition, and, absolutely most importantly for our story, it offered federally guaranteed home mortgage loans.
To give you an idea of the sheer scale of the state intervention, consider this. The government had spent an astonishing $14 billion on veterans' educational benefits alone by 1952. That is a staggering amount of money, and it fundamentally changed the skill level and productivity of the entire American workforce. But the housing subsidies? Those were even more transformative.
Let's see how this built a completely new landscape. It wasn't just the individual home buyer getting help. The government essentially de-risked the entire housing market. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, in the VA guaranteed loans to builders. These were called production advances. This allowed builders, like William Levitt, to essentially reverse the Detroit assembly line. Instead of cars moving past workers, the workers moved past the houses, mass-producing homes in giant developments like Levittown. Then, the FHA and VA guaranteed the mortgages for the buyers, meaning banks took almost zero risk. If a buyer defaulted, well, the taxpayer footed the bill. This caused housing starts to completely skyrocket, with 10 million new homes built between 1946 and 1953 alone.
But we have to look at Theme 4, because this state-sponsored prosperity was absolutely not shared equally: segregation and the wealth gap. This theme demonstrates a stark continuity in systemic racism, showing how Black Americans were explicitly locked out of this wealth generation. You've likely heard the term redlining. Well, the FHA and VA adopted appraisal systems that explicitly tied mortgage eligibility to race. The government's own manuals insisted that neighborhoods must remain racially segregated to retain their property value. Neighborhoods with even a small minority population were literally outlined in red on maps, deemed hazardous investments, and wholly denied these government-backed wealth-building mortgages. This essentially subsidized the white flight to the suburbs, while forcing minorities into decaying urban centers that were completely starved of investment capital.
Meanwhile, private real estate practices totally preyed on the racial fears these policies created. In a practice called blockbusting, speculators would scare white homeowners into selling their homes super cheaply by warning them that minorities were moving in. Then, they'd turn right around and sell those exact same homes to desperate Black families at wildly inflated prices. And because banks wouldn't give Black families traditional mortgages, speculators sold these homes on contract. This meant the buyer had all the responsibilities of a homeowner, but built exactly zero equity. Miss one single payment and you were evicted, losing everything. It was a mechanism for extracting wealth, not building it.
To truly grasp the historical argument of how a subsidized racial wealth gap was engineered, consider this staggering number. The FHA and VA financed nearly $120 billion in new housing between the end of World War II and the late 1960s.
And here's the statistic that really hits home. Of that $120 billion in federally backed wealth-generating real estate, less than 2% was realistically available to non-whites. This stark disparity perfectly illustrates how government policy directly engineered suburban racial segregation. When a $5,000 Levittown house appreciated to $300,000 decades later, that was generational wealth passed down to white children, while Black families were structurally excluded from the exact same opportunity.
All right, let's bring all these themes together for a quick synthesis before you dive into reading the actual chapter. These are the core ideas you should use as a framework for your reading. First, the 1950s were definitely not an era of pure, untouched free market capitalism. Prosperity was heavily fueled by government intervention. Second, the Cold War spurred military Keynesianism, which directly caused a huge boom in tech and infrastructure. Third, the suburban American dream was heavily subsidized by the government, de-risking the housing and highway markets. And finally, that subsidized dream was explicitly segregated by design, structurally locking minorities out of generational wealth.
So, as you crack open your textbook and start reading, keep this final question in the back of your mind. We aren't just studying the past here, we're studying the blueprints of the present. Consider how the historical developments of the 1950s, where people live, how wealth is distributed, and the true role of the government in the economy built the exact framework of the society we live in right now. Good luck with your reading, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.